Welcome to MBA 543. I am Adam Conrad, your instructor with St. Francis University, and this is Chapter 13, Negotiating Buyer Concerns. Some of the learning objectives for this chapter involve describing the principles of formal negotiations as part of the win-win strategy, describing the common types of buyer concerns, discussing specific methods of negotiating buyer concerns, outlining methods for creating value in formal negotiations, and work with buyers who are trained in negotiations. So we have been working down through the 6-step presentation plan, and we've gotten through approach, need discovery. In Chapter 12, we did presentation, and this chapter, Chapter 13, we'll be talking negotiation. Understanding negotiation. So negotiation, one definition, is working to reach an agreement that is mutually satisfactory to both buyer and seller. Negotiation involves resolving the problems or concerns that prevent people from buying. As we noted in Chapter 1, the salesperson increasingly serves as a consultant or resource and provides solution to buyers' problems. The consultant seeks to establish and maintain long-term relationships with their customers. The ability to negotiate problems or objectives is one of the most effective ways to create value for the customer. So planning for negotiation. So today, salespeople must be prepared to anticipate and negotiate buyer concerns and problems. To negotiate with clients effectively, salespeople first need to engage in detailed planning. Ironically, one of the most common mistakes negotiators commit is not doing their homework. They don't gather enough information prior to the negotiation. So when you plan for negotiation, you're strategically planning for the negotiation of buyer concerns. You anticipate their concerns, review common types of resistance, review methods of negotiating buyer resistance. You prepare a negotiation worksheet. Some of the activities during negotiations will be recognizing and understanding verbal and nonverbal cues, validating the problem, finding some point of agreement, not allowing anger to take over, answering your customers' concerns, and be alert for closing cues. I'll give a great example of negotiating, and this is just go back a few years. And this will, for many of you, what a VCR is. So years ago, when I was in college, I sold VCRs at the mall at a stereo video store, and literally, folks were amazed that you could record television. I know this is going back a few years, and many of you don't even have a video cassette recorder or a VCR. In any case, I would be describing video cassette recorders or VCRs, and I would have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 people show up and listen to me talk about how these devices worked. And I would often stop my presentation, rather than go through the whole presentation of what I was doing. I would literally stop, and I'd see a couple of people like kind of anxious, and I'd be like, anyone want to take one right now? And without even finishing my presentation, 2 or 3 people out of the crowd would actually say, yeah, I'll take one now. And I actually worked out a deal with the cashiers to actually help me and paid them to actually write up my sales so that I could actually continue to sell to the other folks and actually peel off a couple of folks with VCR, give them the cart, and they carried it up to the register, and they got written up, and I got commission for those items. So I sold lots and lots of VCRs in the day. I know that's an old example, but that reminds me when I see be alert for closing cues, because I could tell when some people were ready to buy, and I literally just peel them off and say, would you like to take one? And I give them one, and they go up to the counter. That was a great way to make more income and not, as we say, walk past the sale. So they were already ready to buy. Why keep talking? And then for some other folks, I had to continue. Planning for formal negotiations. So if you're going to have formal negotiations, you want to gather all your information. You want to decide whether you're going to do negotiation as a team or as an individual. You got to decide who's going to be in the negotiation. Value should not only be thought of in terms of purchase price, since there are many aspects to a deal beyond price. In setting goals, the concept of BATNA, which we're going to talk about, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, is important. The salesperson should have a clear agenda and be prepared to adapt just as he or she would in other aspects of the sales process. And a negotiations worksheet will help the salesperson be systematically organized, which is also talked about in a later slide. So let's talk about a BATNA, because a lot of people have never heard of a BATNA. BATNA is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So what alternatives will be acceptable to you if your negotiation does not succeed? What alternatives will be acceptable to your customer if his or her negotiation does not succeed? So if the customer doesn't get the deal they want with you, what is out there that they could go to instead? That's the BATNA. And so it's really important to know in negotiating, if your competitor is right there neck and neck with you, how hard you're going to negotiate with this particular prospect might be difficult, because their BATNA might be, hey, I can just go to vendor B and pick up this same solution for almost the same price. It's not my preferred one, but it'll do. And so that's important for you to know and for them to know what the best alternative to a negotiated agreement is. You may have, and again, this doesn't work as much in software on this vendor side, because your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, if your negotiation doesn't succeed, is you may not have another customer to buy. But if you have a unique product, like say you're trying to sell an automobile on Craigslist and you've got 6 or 7 people calling, you have an audience. As a seller, you have a best alternative to negotiated agreement. If negotiation fails with the first person, you may have the second person lined up ready to go. So that matters in terms of your negotiation. You're going to be as willing to drop the price knowing I've got 2 or 3 more people who are willing to pay the price. So that's what BATNA stands for. And it's always important to know in any negotiation what your BATNA is. And that's probably a completely new concept to you. And if you'd like more discussion on that, feel free to email me. But that is a key ingredient that a lot of folks are not familiar with when it comes to negotiating. The ZOPA, or the Zone of Possible Agreement, is another important planning tool, is defined as the space between the seller's walk-away point and the buyer's highest expectation, highest willingness to pay. So the walk-away point represents the lowest offer a party would be willing to accept, and is also called the reservation value. For example, if your walk-away point is $42.65 million and the highest price the buyer is willing to pay is $48 million, your ZOPA is any offer that falls within this range. Let me bring this home to real estate, because we deal with this all the time. The zone of possible agreement is the seller selling a house for $200,000, the buyer's at $180,000. That zone of possible agreement is there's $20,000 difference between the two in terms of offer price. But the seller might be willing to go to 190 and the buyer might be willing to go to 190. So it's really important to figure out what that zone of possible agreement is, because if you can get that, you can figure out a way to bring the parties together and get that deal done. So it's really important to figure out ZOPA. By the way, a BATNA for a home purchase is difficult, because the buyer, if you're selling condos or townhouses and they're relatively uniform and there's 50 of them available, the BATNA for the buyer is easy. They can just pick a different one. But the reality for most buyers is they're buying a unique property, and if they really, really like that one property, they don't have a best alternative. And so they really have to negotiate for this one particular property if this is the one they want, because there's not a lot of alternatives out there. So that's important to realize when you're a seller and if you've got a unique property. Again, it's not really great if you're a seller and there's 50 different ones they could choose from different builders. It makes it less powerful for you. I hope that helps drive that point home. Let's talk about some of the objections, because in negotiation, you're going to have objections. The objection that the prospect might say, the price is too high. So their source of hesitation is the perceived cost versus benefit for them is too low. So we need to figure out ways to get them to understand where the value is and understand and restate the value proposition. If they say they're going to think about it, they're afraid to make a bad decision, or they may be waiting for more other opportunities to come along. So your request is to create comfort. You want to create comfort, provide proof. If they want to talk to the boss, they're unable to justify their decision. So this comes down to risk reduction and benefit review. Remember that when you're selling into companies, you're selling more into safety. So what I mean by that is people are looking for, when they make a purchase or a decision, they want to make sure it's a safe decision. They don't want to be held accountable for something that was a bad decision. So that's why a lot of times you'll see this. I got to think about it. I got to talk to the boss, because they want to make sure they don't make a bad decision. So they're set with their current provider. You get this a lot. They don't see the benefit of change. And remember that change is difficult and time consuming. So you're going to have to be able to differentiate and show, why this is so important to them to make that change. So there's a lot of details in here, and handling objections and doing it in a way that is not confrontational is going to be very much a skill. And again, it is a learned skill. Nobody is a born negotiator. They're going to learn over time. Oftentimes you'll say, well, they're intuitive, or they have a gut feel for negotiation. I would tell you instead that is a learned behavior, and that is pattern recognition. So that when people say that's intuition, I say, no, that's pattern recognition, because simply people have seen this before in another environment, and they're applying what they learned before to this particular situation. So it's pattern recognition. Conducting a negotiation session. Some golden rules for that are successful in formal negotiation is understanding the problem, creating alternative solutions that can add value, periodically reviewing the acknowledged points of agreement, not making concessions too quickly, remembering that most negotiations will conclude in the final 20% of time allowed, and know when to walk away. So there's lots of different parts of this. When you're talking about mastering negotiation, again, a lot of this comes down to social interactions and making sure that so negotiations can break down and become bigger than what the real issues are because of real social pressure and social interactions. It happens a lot in real estate. People get very emotional. So it's important to try to keep as much of that out and not let it to swerve into an emotional field. So again, customers' concerns, 15 cases of olives will take up valuable space in my receiving room. It's already crowded. Their type of concern is a need one. So you have a combination of direct denial, superior benefit. So you will not have to face that problem. With the aid of our merchandising plan, you can display 10 cases immediately on the sales floor. Only 5 cases will become in reserve stock. You should move all 15 cases in about 2 weeks. So you can see knowing a lot about their business and about how you can solve their problems is key. Another example, the customer says, this is a poor time of the year to buy a large order of olives. People are not buying olives at this time. So they have their concern is a time problem. So again, combination of indirect denial, third-party testimony. I agree that it's been a problem in the past, but consumer attitudes seem to be changing. We have found that olives olives sell well all year long if displayed properly. More people are using olives in the preparation of omelets, pizza, and other dishes. Of course, most relish trays feature olives. We will supply you with point-of-purchase material that will provide kitchen-tested ways to use this high-profit item. So other objections they may give you. I have to stay within my budget. So that's a price objection. As you know, olives represent a high-profit item. This average margin is 26%. With the addition of our $1 per case allowance, the margin will be about 30%. This will give you a good return. I'm very satisfied with my existing supplier. Boy, you'll get this a lot. So this is a source concern. So you solve this with a combination question trial order. What can I do to get you to take a trial order? Can I get you to try it? There's a concept in sales that involves this trial piece. And it's really, this is a really important strategy. And I find this works really well in things like choosing a provider like in real estate, like a mortgage loan originator or an inspector or any other service provider related to a transaction. And that's the notion of getting somebody to switch for a designated period of time. I've read in different places that it takes 90 days to form a habit. So if you could get them to form a habit and order from you or try your service for 90 days, you've essentially switched them. And if you can hang on to them for that 90-day period, you've got them for some period of time. And it really comes down to then servicing the sale and making sure you follow up. But that 90-day period is kind of a switching mentality that once they get used to you for 3 months, that you're going to be working with them for some time. And so that habit-forming change or that change in their habits, you can get that to happen. It's extremely powerful. And a trial might be the way you have to get it started. But again, you're going to have to service it and make sure that they get the benefit of the service. So another discussion area, which we'll put into a class or put into an assignment, is think of a time when you negotiated for something. Did you follow the guidelines for conducting negotiations? Was there something you would wish you had done differently? Oh, we can all think of that, right? How about negotiating across cultures? Because different cultures negotiate differently. It's important to understand and accommodate the customer's culture when negotiating in the international arena. Selling in certain cultures often requires more time in bonding and building a rapport. So you don't just sit down and start negotiating. There's a lot of social activity that's going to take place in advance. Several meetings may be needed to lay the groundwork for the actual sale. And that's difficult, particularly if you've got quotas and you're under pressure and we live in a fast-paced society. We expect people to just make quick decisions. You'll find that that's not the case in a lot of cultures. Understanding types of buyer concerns. There's 5 common types of buyer concerns. They're concerns related to the product. They're related to the service. They're related to source. They're related to time and related to price. So that we saw that back in that negotiation example with the olives. So there's different types of buyer concerns. A direct denial. When you're negotiating the buyer concerns, there can be a direct denial, which involves refuting the opinion or belief or belief of a prospect, and the indirect denial, which means to bend a little and acknowledge that prospect is partially correct. So obviously, when buyers say they have an objection and you directly deny it, I mean, obviously you're going to have to be very careful about how you manage that discussion. So there are again these 8 different methods of negotiating buyer concerns. You can use questions. You can use superior benefit, demonstration, a trial offer, a third-party testimony, or the postpone method. The trial offer, oftentimes we refer to that as the puppy dog close. I mean, I can attest to this personally. You take your children to the pet store because they want to look at a puppy. You're not coming out of there without a puppy. It's going to be very difficult to not get out of there. I know personally. So trial offers can be very helpful. Demonstration, installing the product or service for a demonstration. The other potential problem with those, though, with demonstration and trial offers, is they can find flaws in the product and stop using it, or they lack full commitment to the implementation of it, which can be a problem as well. So sometimes software can be very difficult that way with trial offers. If it's a complex product, it's hard to set up and get them to use it for any period of time. Successful salespeople are sensitive to clues that indicate the client feels something is wrong. One way to empathize with the client's concerns is to use the feel, felt, found strategy. Here's how it works. Assume the customer is concerned about the complexity of the new computer software and says, "I don't think I will ever understand the process." Your response might be, "I understand how you feel, Mr. Pearson. Many of my customers felt the same way until they started using the software and found it quite easy to master." So that's that feel, felt, found. The customer expresses concern about it, and then, "I understand how you feel," and then you describe how others have overcome it. The next thing we're going to be talking about is overcoming price objections, because people will all the time make price objections. There's some do's and don'ts with price objections. You want to clarify the price concerns with questions. Do add value with a cluster of satisfactions. Explain how these work. Do not make price the focal point of the sales presentation. Do not apologize for price. Look, I'm sorry, I apologize that our price is really a lot higher, or, and try to apologize for it. You need to justify the price and why it's more. Do point out the relationship between price and quality, and do explain and demonstrate the difference between price and cost. Price does not equal cost, right? Give the example of the truck tires. Your truck tires might cost $1,000 to put truck tires on the truck, but that's not the cost, because the cost equals taking the truck off the road for a couple of days to get it to a depot center to have the tires replaced, ordering the tires, getting them in, having them installed, discarding the old tires. It's not just the price of new tires, it's the cost of having to replace them is the issue. Working with the fifth and final learning objective of this chapter is understand how to work with buyers who are trained negotiators. Professional buyers often learn to use specific tactics in dealing with salespeople. Example, in the budget limitation tactic, the buyer may say, "We like your proposal, but our budget for the convention is only $8,500. Is the buyer telling the truth, or is the person testing your price? The best approach in this instance, is to take the budget limitations seriously and use appropriate negotiation strategies. One strategy is to reduce the price by eliminating some items, sometimes described as unbundling. So you take something out. Say, look, we can do $8,500. We're just going to have to take out the extra, the meal plan, and then we can do it. The 5 tactics in this slide represent only a sample of those used by professional buyers. To prepare for these and other tactics, salespeople need to plan their negotiating strategies in advance and have clear goals. Decide in advance on the terms you can and cannot accept. It's important that you have the authority to set prices. Buyers want to do business with someone who has decision-making authority. So that gets described a lot. We'll have to talk more about that, because there's this notion of higher authority that says that if you have the end ability to negotiate price, that they're going to actually take advantage of that, whereas instead you say, look, I don't have the authority to alter the price. Let me go back and talk to my manager and see what we can do. Gives you another step to actually help in that negotiating process. You can actually say, look, if I could get you that price, talk to my manager and get you that price, will you order it by the end of this quarter? Will you sign the purchase order today? So you can actually do some give and take with that strategy. Budget limitation, we talked about. Take it or leave it tactic. This is our offer, take it or leave it. Let us split the difference. By the way, there's a strategy that says whoever splits the difference first loses. So somebody offers to split the difference. Let me give you an example. A house is listed for $200,000. The buyer offers $180,000. The seller comes back and says, let's split the difference, right? And now the seller has agreed to go to $190,000. The buyer then is working off of a $190,000 price and says, well, let's just split the difference. Now you're at $185,000. You see the difference here in what happens. The seller's actually gone down to $185,000 by splitting the difference first. There's a notion in negotiating that you actually want to stick to what we call an anchor price. So an anchor price is going to be, the seller's at $200,000 and the buyer's at $180,000. The anchor price negotiating strategy says, if the buyer comes in and says $180,000, and the seller's at $200,000 list price, the seller comes back and says, I appreciate your offer for $180,000, I'll do $197,500. Now you're negotiating off of a $197,500 price, not off of the $180,000 price. So the seller has stuck to their anchor. Of course, the buyer, if they're coached well, will stick to their anchor and say, well, I'll do $182,500. And now we have this zone of possible, a zone of a possible sale here, a ZOPA, where you're actually looking at it and say, well, can we get this deal together? Splitting the difference obviously can hurt the seller if they agree to split it right off the bat. And I see this tactic a lot. You got to be very careful. If you don't know how to negotiate, it can cost you tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. The other strategy is, and I get this one a lot, let's sell it low now, we'll make profits later. So once you give me this price on this now, we'll probably end up ordering more from you later. There's no guarantee that's going to happen. And here's a great way to negotiate that one. We get this a lot with people who have, particularly with investors, who say, look, I'm going to be selling, I have 20 properties to sell. Why don't you give me a better commission rate on the sale of this property, because I got a bunch more to sell. And instead I'll say, you know what, we're happy to help you out with that, but I'll give you the rebate on the last one, not the first one, or on the last 5, not on the first one. That way you get the business for the ones right now and not on the future, and not bet that you're going to get that future listing. So in review of the negotiating chapter 13, we've described the principles of formal negotiation as part of the win-win strategy, described the common types of buyer concerns, discussed specific methods of negotiating buyer concerns. We've outlined methods for creating value in formal negotiations and worked with buyers who are trained in negotiations. I'd read up more on that if you intend to get into sales. You want to know way more about buyers who are trained in negotiating. And that concludes chapter 13.